name is Rob Barron. I'm the Executive Director of Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact. Welcome to another installment of our Countdown to Coalition series. Countdown to Coalition is a series of blog posts and videos that build up to the launch of our new brand in March of 2024. Minnesota Campus Compact was founded 30 years ago, and Iowa Campus Compact has been around for over 20 years. Two organizations formally merged in the fall of 2022. And 2024 marks the end of our affiliation with Campus Compact. This series is all about how our new brand connects with the foundational work and traditions of our decades of service in both states. Today, I'm joined by two leaders in the field of higher education, civic, and community engagement in the Midwest. Let me introduce them. Nick Benson serves as the Executive Director of Office of Community Engagement at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. In that role, he provides leadership on campus for community-engaged teaching, learning, and research. He's worked for 12 years in various community engagement roles at the University of Iowa, including as Director of the Iowa Initiative for Sustainable Communities and Director of Community Development and Outreach. David Weerts is a professor and faculty director for academic planning and programs in the Office of Public Engagement at the University of Minnesota System. His scholarly work is focused on helping college and university leaders build productive relationships with external partners, including state policymakers, community partners, alumni, and donors. As such, his research lies at the intersections of state-university relations, community engagement, institutional advancement, higher education leadership, and organizational development. Both Nick and David are also longstanding members of the Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact Board. Thank you both for taking the time to be with me today. So the first question I want to ask the two of you centers around this idea that colleges and universities have a public purpose. Now, the concept of a public purpose will be perceived differently based on traditions of how folks understand public good. Now, you have each given much thought to this concept, including David, a paper you authored with Kayla Leiftog, who was then a doctoral student with you and now a member of our team here at Campus Compact. In that paper, you wrote that public good is viewed in different ways across a variety of ideological, disciplinary, and regional institutional contexts. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, sure. And first, thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. And yeah, the paper you referenced, Rob, Kayla and I were asked as a SAGE encyclopedia group to do a couple of page definition of the public good, which seems like a really daunting kind of task to say of these different groups. And as we started to conceptualize how people were writing about this, we landed on really three kind of buckets of areas of how this was being written about in different ways. And so just to kind of quickly summarize that, hopefully steers our conversation in some ways, as we saw three different visions of the public good. One that we might call public good for the prosperous society, a second one we might call public good for the equitable society, and a third public good for the good society. And to kind of differentiate, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, although they're becoming more rivalrous, and we can maybe talk more about that later, is a public good for the prosperous society really focuses on people who think about the public good in economic development terms and think about students and faculty and others in more human capital kind of discussions. So that is to say, how do we engage in communities in ways that provide workforce needs in a way that will bring a prosperous community. So I think they center on what's more like a classical liberal approach to this. Some people might call that like neoliberal approach. The second way around the equitable society, that comes from more progressive traditions. Many in the social sciences think through this. It's more around, rather than human capital, it's more around human rights in the sense, especially identity-based freedoms and thinking about inequities in society. So public good being, how do we think about coming along communities in a way that can close these gaps? So there's a lot, so people write from this tradition and think about that way. The third one is public good for the good society. And what that is, these have a kind of earlier origins in actually Aristotelian thought and more theological centered thought, where it's more around, instead of human capital or human rights, it's about human flourishing. which has to do with how we think about communities live in harmony with one another, how individuals have purpose and meaning. And so some of this vision of the good is not necessarily materialistic in a sense, but it has broader non-materialistic ways around what are the ultimate ends of what it means to be a human person, for example. So these are broad, and we see some, faith-based colleges are very in tune to this tradition through different theological lenses. So those are the ways that we've kind of been thinking about this, and these traditions live within our campuses and across our states. So that's a little bit of what the paper was about.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now, Nick, you've got years of experience and years of deep thought on this same question as well. I'm curious what your thoughts and reactions are to what David says.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I think this is an important paper because I think it's valuable for us to sort of think about how we all come to this work, and the traditions that we come from, whether that's as faculty members or as staff or as students. But the other thing I think we have to keep in mind is that our community partners are part of this conversation as well, and they come to this work from their own perspectives and their own approaches. And so part of the reason why that's important for us to keep in mind is because doing publicly engaged work, thinking about how higher education can be involved in making, being a partner in the change that we want to see in our society, we need to have principles and practices that we hold on to that help us do that work in a way that is advancing the goals and objectives that we're seeking. And so it's important for us to think about how these different sort of approaches to thinking about the public good impacts what those principles and practices are. And I think it was really sort of important and valuable work for David to sort of enlighten us on this, because I think it also is important to recognize that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think that in some ways that's one of the values of an engaged process, is that it's a very iterative process, and it's also something that helps us all come together and sort of recognize sort of how our goals and objectives align in with one another. And so I think that it's always good for us when we're thinking about this work to sort of recognize where we come from and think about how that impacts the principles and practices that we're using to do this work. That means that we're all being transparent and open and communicative with one another, and hopefully will lead us to more mutually beneficial partnerships, both with campus and with our community partners.
Thank you, Nick. Now, if you don't mind, appreciate if you kind of reflect a bit on how that public purpose for higher education relates to its role in a more engaged democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the public purpose of higher education, in particular, how public engagement plays such a critical role in higher education, really helps form a bedrock for our students, but also us as faculty and staff and administrators at at universities and colleges, how we understand the ways in which our students, our young leaders, are going to be able to connect the society that they're going to be living in the future. And if democracy is all about people being a part of our society, being a part of the process of thinking about the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities that our world faces today, being a part of that, and not just a part of it, but a part of the solutions that we want to see, then that means that we need to be, as higher education institutions, giving our students, giving our faculty and staff, but our students in particular, the opportunity to understand how they can play a role in that democratic society, not once they graduate, not once they're already out in the world working, doing their professions, but while they're students at the University of Iowa. And honestly, I think that this is really an important thread that needs to run throughout education in general. The value of this is that our students then begin to learn, at a younger age, but certainly when they're in colleges and universities, what it means to make a difference on the issues that they care about. And through public engagement in higher education, we're giving students the platform to be able to do that while they're part of an educational system. And the great thing about that is that it ties everything that they're learning in the classroom, everything they're learning on our campuses across the Midwest and beyond, to the very issues that they want to make a difference in. And when we can do that, we unlock the potential for our students, who are our future leaders in our country, to be able to know how to effectively engage with a society in which we want people to be affecting and making change on the issues that they care about. And I think that that's also really relevant for higher education, because it means that we're not just training and educating our students around sort of the traditional subject matters that we study, but we're really educating them to be, impactful global citizens. And public engagement is a really critical vehicle for us to be able to do that.
David, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how the public purpose of higher education then relates to higher education's role in sustaining a more engaged democracy.
Yeah, thanks. And I really appreciate Nick's comments and really resonate with what he talked about. Maybe some additional thoughts I have on it is thinking about where we are in this moment in society around depolarization and quite frankly, it seems kind of lack of empathy. So I think, part of it, of what we think about engaged democracy um, is thinking about even these traditions that I laid out, that in some ways these is becoming kind of rivalrous in ways, and people are coming to it. And maybe the role of higher education in this space is how do we help students build empathy and understanding where people are coming from in different ways, knowing that increasingly around people's visions of society that there's deep moral disagreement. And so how do we even support through an engaged democracy civic virtues that help people work together in ways that are productive? I think about there's this great book a couple of years ago called Toward a More Confident Pluralism by John Inazu at Washington University, St. Louis. But he writes about people coming to a place of tolerance for political disagreement and around humility in their. So I think there's a role that we can play around in higher education institutions. I think here in Minnesota too, there's a Minnesota Humanities Center is pioneering now what's called the Third Way Civics program to kind of help people understand not just kind of, as Nick was saying, people might have traditional, like a constitutional view of citizenship and teaching around that, but these other ways and how you bring these together that people can work together to build a common good. Because I feel like that's an area that higher ed can really step into, that it feels like we need a lot of help in that area. So that's why I feel like engaged democracy, what higher ed can bring to it, is an opportunity for us to really support the engaged democracy in that way. So just some thoughts on that.
I really, and I don't mean to jump in, but one other thing too with that, David, that I think really speaks to the importance of public engagement in higher education then, is that one of the best ways for us to build that empathy with our students, to learn how to work across differences, is for them to be involved in the very communities in which that work is going on day in and day out. And the truth is that I don't think we can really get there in higher education unless if we partner with our communities, unless if we lean into community engagement, because that's where we really see the opportunity for our students to understand how our differences, how all of these different approaches to thinking about the challenges and opportunities that our world faces, how this actually can move forward in our world today.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you both. And another question I'd like to ask you both in this setting is something that the three of us have talked about offline a little bit, which is the importance of doing this work in the Midwest right now. And I think that's something that, for institutions based in Iowa and Minnesota, is something it's worth centering, is, the significance of that place-based nature of how we come together and how we do that work. And so David, and then Nick, if you have any thoughts or reactions to what it means to do engagement work in higher education in the Midwest as opposed to on the coast or the South or anywhere else in this country?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is just around the unique geography and demographics of the Midwest and how things are changing. And I know we've all talked about one of the things on our campus and throughout our states is around the rural-urban divide and different issues that we're kind of working through. That some challenges are the same across those two, but there's increasing some tensions that we're seeing. I think about when we read our local newspapers and seeing the comment section on some things when they're talking about statewide. It's very interesting to watch, how people are framing the problems that are somewhat geographical in nature. I think even just one thing from the Midwest too is the future of small towns and rural areas. And this point that Nick made in the last piece of how our students might be engaged more directly in these particular areas, who in many cases might want to return to these areas. There's always a stress around even just attention. I think here in Minnesota that some of these students come from small areas and they come to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and there's a resentment that they might not come back to support their communities and kind of be stewards of those areas. So we're thinking about how do we think about more holistically, I think in our particular state, around where we do to support kind of a one Minnesota kind of view, perhaps that's similar in Iowa. So those kind of things come to mind in terms of what are some challenges and the future economy. I think about here in Minnesota as well, one of the main issues is the future workforce around because we're losing great people to stay here and live. So, and that relates a little bit to the prosperous society, but some of the other ones as well too. So I think there are a lot of unique challenges, and I'd be curious, kind of Nick, kind of your thoughts about that as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that everything that you just said, David, resonates here in Iowa. I would say maybe we have a little bit less of this extreme or maybe perceived dichotomy between a very large urban area and a rural part of the rest of the state, but we certainly do have this urban-rural divide that I think can sort of permeate some of the thoughts and approaches that we take. But one of the things that I think is so valuable about leaning into the public purpose of higher education within the Midwest context and the urban-rural divide is to be able to showcase that there are so many complex issues that our rural communities are facing, both in Iowa and in Minnesota, and that the best way for us to figure out a future in which our rural communities are prosperous and our urban communities are prosperous is for higher education institutions like University of Minnesota, like the University of Iowa, and all of the others that are part of the coalition. If we lean into getting our students connected to our rural communities, if we lean into our institutions partnering and in a mutually beneficial way with our rural communities and our urban communities, then especially when we're working through this reciprocal, mutually beneficial process, it leads us to, I think, better understanding of what a shared future might look like. That includes our students, includes our young people who, as everybody wants, would, or many communities want, our young people to stay. It's a lot easier for our young people to see a shared future when they're a part of the conversations in higher education in our communities. So I think that there's a real opportunity with public engagement. I think there's also a lot of challenges because I think that many times in higher education, we talk about public engagement from a very sort of central place-based approach of working within a specific geographic boundary of an institution. And I think that there's a lot of challenges, but also opportunities when we think more broadly about how can higher education be publicly engaged, not just within a maybe 50-mile or 60-mile radius of us, but really across the entire state and beyond. And the truth is that that's what's going to help us unlock understanding, is when we're able to sort of think beyond a particular geographic boundary and begin to think about the challenges and opportunities that face us, and and in a way in which we're sort of all coming together around these issues and trying to create shared goals and opportunities.
Well, David, do you have thoughts too on, I mean, I know you've given this one a lot of consideration of what it means to be a civically engaged or community engaged campus in the Midwest right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting thing too. I think about our two institutions too, as University of Iowa, University of Minnesota. We kind of have these unique multi-identity campus institution that we're members of the Big Ten. We have kind of this other kind of international profile. I think thinking about this particular call, one thing that comes to mind is how do we think about balancing our many different stakeholder groups and expectations around making meaning about what engagement is? I think, Nick and I have talked about, in our offices, different times, people will come in to our office around a particular area and they have a very different idea about kind of vision for this than somebody who was just in the office 20 minutes ago to talk. It might be in the health sciences, it might be in the arts, and a lot of these groups have their own disciplinary interests, and there's a lot of loyalty to the field. Foremost, there's actually this whole literature around this of like what they call these organized anarchies that are like the flagship type of institutions. So I center that to say that I think our institutions have great opportunity because of the great resources that we have around working in state. At University of Minnesota, we also benefit greatly from having an extension, which is a long history in the U.S. around work. And so I think, our role at an institution is to help various groups who adhere to these ways of thinking across the state and the region can do this work and be rewarded for it in a way that supports what the community needs and what the region. But then also thinking about, quite frankly, the international side of this, which is so important to many of our scholars. I think about our community engaged winners actually of these national or local awards on campus. Some of them are doing this work in, Papua New Guinea, for example. So I think that's a unique challenge that we have to say of how do we think about our land grant roots, in our case, in our stewardship to the state, and balance all of these kind of areas. So that's a little bit kind of where my mind goes a little bit around the challenge we have as a system office to say what are the unique mission and value that each of the 5 campuses in our case bring to this area. So that's a little bit where my mind goes, I guess.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. So y'all have been very generous with your time. I have one last question to ask you before we wrap this up. And that centers on the fact that, for those 30 years that we've been doing this work in Minnesota and 20 years in Iowa, this coalition of colleges and universities is a very diverse one, diverse in terms of institution size, type, location, resources, certainly. And so from the two of your perspective, you don't mind, what is the promise, the opportunity, the challenge of having that diverse coalition of colleges and universities engaged in sustaining this public purpose for higher education?
Yeah, I think that one of the best things about a coalition of higher education institutions that are committed to the public purpose of higher education is that we can all learn so much from one another, because even though there are differences in where we sit in terms of urban versus rural environments and how large we are, there's a lot of sort of central principles around our what we're trying to achieve in terms of the public purpose of higher education, that we can learn so much from one another. And I think that many times the best sort of ideas come from multiple folks being together in a room saying, here's the challenges that we're facing. For example, with this urban-rural divide question, right? It's not going to just be the two largest institutions in Iowa and Minnesota that are going to have to be a part of this conversation. It's got to also be, smaller liberal arts colleges and community colleges and, two-year institutions. And, so it really takes all of us to be a part of these conversations. And that's where coalition is so important, because if you have a coalition of institutions that are working together, if there's, sort of central goals and objectives, then wherever you are, whether, like you said, you're in a large city or in a small town, or whether you're a large R1 or a smaller liberal arts college, we're all working towards a similar purpose, and we can all learn a lot from one another. But it's never going to just be, one or two or three institutions that are going to be making a difference. It's going to be all of us working together, because the truth is that all of the issues that are part of building an informed, engaged democracy, those are multifaceted issues that impact everybody. And so it's going to take all of us working together to be able to affect change.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And another thing I might add to think about is, and even to kind of to what Nick said, is what I really love about these different campuses coming together is, their unique histories and stories and foundings and views of the good, and how they've thought about their commitment to their particular regions and campuses. And what I always found really helpful in these settings too is it's building the empathy part around, because sometimes on our own campus, we're here in the middle of the city, you kind of have your own world, you get very siloed around. And I even think about, just steps away from us is Augsburg, that's doing all this great stuff, but they come from this, as President Pribanow calls about the saga of an urban settlement, and they have this whole history around their engagement in Augsburg. And I think it's helpful for these various campuses to understand how these groups come together in various different ways, and to kind of to Nick's point, how do we bring our individual kind of notions of these and our even our approaches and methodologies into a collective that we can serve the common good, and to see where all the institutions with communities can thrive in different ways toward a more collective good. So I think that's a fascinating part of it, and rewarding as well, I think, for people in the coalition and the community partners that come into these spaces as well. So.
Well, thank you both. We're at time. It has just been a pleasure to sit here and pepper the two of you with questions. This work is so significant, not just for the institutions that my colleagues and I are fortunate enough to work with, but then for our communities and for our states and for this region. And so I'm grateful to the two of you for both for your time, but also just for the deep thought and reflection that you offer. For those of you that are watching, very thankful for your time and attention. Thanks for being part of this Countdown to Coalition series with us. We so look forward to sharing our new brand and identity with you all just weeks away in March 2024. And until then, we look forward to seeing you, working with you, talking with you in the future. Thank you.